at 10 a.m. Pacific.
From Nashville, filling in for Whitley Strieber, this is William Henry, and this is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Imagine hacking your way through an impenetrable rainforest in search of a secret cave loaded with records of a lost civilization. At the cave's entrance, you see mystic symbols. One of them is the open sesame, but which one? The fact is, according to our guest today, Mr. Stan Hall, a system of tunnels and caves beneath Ecuador and Peru is reputed to hold an ancient treasure house of artifacts and objects of incalculable value for humanity, including 2 libraries, one containing metal books inscribed or embossed with strange inscriptions and geometric designs, and the other storing tablets of crystal. Today we're also going to pull on the thread of a golden thread of prehistory in search of a lost key of knowledge in the archives of Atlantis. My readers may think I'm talking about the lost language of the birds, the mysterious ancient language the alchemist Fulcanelli called the language of the gods, which was believed to have been spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which some think was Atlantis, and that this language was also recovered by King Solomon. Stan Hall, however, will give us reason to think that the original Eden, or center of humankind, was in the shadows of the Andes in South America, not southern Iraq. He'll tell us about his expedition to the caves of Tayos, meaning birds, a place in Ecuador, and his quest for a library of metal plates written long ago in the language of the gods. In 1976, Stan Hall, a Scottish engineer, organized a landmark expedition to the caves of the Tayos Indians in Ecuador. This search involved a dozen institutions, Joint Special Forces, and astronaut Professor Neill Armstrong as honorary president and participant. Stan was driven by curiosity about Eric von Daniken's report of this metal library allegedly found in the caves by investigator Juan Maurice in the 1960s and published in von Daniken's 1972 blockbuster Gold of the Gods. His book, Tayos Gold, The Archives of Atlantis, tells his story and that of many other amazing explorers. He joins us today from Scotland. Stan, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you.
Our pleasure. Your story is incredible. It spans decades, and I hope that in the next hour or so we're able to flesh it out to your satisfaction. In thinking about this, Stan, I'm thinking it might be best for us to begin by talking about the subject of ancient archives, since this is the backdrop of your story. And in reading your book, I was very interested in your remarks about the archives and treasure sought by Nebuchadnezzar. How about if we start by talking about those archives?
Well, you know the story of Nebuchadnezzar, who sacked Jerusalem a couple of times around 600 BC, and supposedly took the treasures of Jerusalem away. However, there are a number of other possibilities. You will know that quite a number of groups are looking into alternative history for the movement of the children of Israel across the desert out of Egypt, whether in fact there's an Essene contact between the Egyptian priesthoods, perhaps those called the Choshen, which then may well have become the Chosen under the Israeli flag. But it's quite clear in the Bible that the Israelis not only were accompanied by a group of Egyptians, but that they took the treasures of Egypt out of Egypt. Now, when I was at Sunday school, nobody told me that. I found that out a long time later. And the Church of the Latter-day Saints also have a metal library at the back of their history, and about 600 BC. And there seems to be, to me, a possible connection there around that time of Nebuchadnezzar's invasions of Palestine. Now, I know quite a bit about the Mormon history, as it's called, and I hope any Mormons listening in will forgive me for using the term Mormon, because the term Latter-day Saints is something that's very long to say when you're speaking about this subject. And they also have a connection in their history with America, and I know their historians and anthropologists investigate a great deal in Central and South America. And the treasures that one is talking about with Nebuchadnezzar are very difficult to identify. One knows that when there is an invading army, the first thing they look for are the national archives and the secret deposits of the nation they're invading in order to immediately try to humiliate them. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, did not drop from the sky. He was riding his chariot, and it would take him quite a while to get to where he was expected in Jerusalem. And I think that the priesthood at that time would probably have taken steps to hide what treasures they had. The identification of what these treasures were and where they came from, I think, is a subject of quite a lot of debate.
It's very interesting that in our modern era we saw a dramatic reenactment of this drama in the United States and coalition forces with their invasion of Iraq. It's widely known that Saddam Hussein connected himself, in fact believed he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and like Nebuchadnezzar, assembled a vast library of ancient archives and documents. And what was the very first thing that occurred upon the invasion of Baghdad in 2003? We had the looting of the National Archives of Iraq. Do you find it ironic that that is happening again in our present era?
Yes, it's very, very sad to me. I can remember when I got that on the news, I sat with my jaw dropping because it's something that the whole world should be concerned about. And I think you've hit on something that is worth developing a little. As a young nation, obviously America is interested in their history, is in global history, but I sometimes wonder about something that never seems to get mentioned very much in the Middle East conflict. The Middle Eastern peoples, if we can call them that, go back a very long time, so obviously their culture and their way of looking at things is much older and longer tested than perhaps a younger nation like America. And I sometimes wonder if that's not something that should be considered by Washington and initially by Saddam Hussein and his government. The trouble is, when you get a dictator in power, there is absolutely no reasoning with them. And someone as egocentric as Hussein is very, very difficult to deal with. And if he sees himself as a mission, then it's impossible to deal with. And, of course, that's what led to the war. But underneath all of this, it is something that is very sad to see history being torn apart. I try to look at the world through a very little formula that all politics comes out of history, and all history comes out of geography. And all geography essentially comes out of geology. And most wars have always been about raw materials and minerals. And there's no escaping this. I'm not saying this is what's going on in Iraq, but it certainly is very difficult to find any war that took place in, let's say, South America that has not been over mineral resources.
Right. Stan, you write that not until the global slaughter of the 20th century did people of all religious persuasion realize the price being paid forth for the deliberate camouflage of historical truth. The bloody 20th century, more than any other, demonstrated how adept at doublespeak and the manipulation of secrecy and fears as weapons of mass control. But let's talk about this idea that there are forces going back into deep history, maybe even connected with the Israelite priesthood of Melchizedek, that knew about our deep ancient past and have used this knowledge to manipulate us on into present times.
Yes, I think that's very true. I think that there is a confrontation between the use of knowledge, between its use for education and its use for manipulation. And these are two global opposing forces. And unfortunately, the faster we move with technology, the more confused, let's say, the masses of people become, and the more easily they are manipulated. And unfortunately, if only because they don't have time, because they're trying to feed their family, or they're trying to get things done quickly during the day. There's so many things to do that the big picture escapes them. And if they're confronted with it, they will very often say, well, I don't really have time to think about that. We'll leave that to the governments. And unfortunately, and the governments know this better than anyone else, I think, that is not really the way to do it. And there's a danger, I feel, that governments, because of the same kinds of problems they have at their levels, are moving further and further away from the ordinary man in the street. And this is why I think there's more concern and more talk of conspiracies and more talk of manipulation and so on going on at this time.
Stan, we have to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'd like to delve deeper into your book, Tayo's Gold, by looking into your story, your investigation and friendship with the scholar and linguist philosopher Juan Maurice. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. We're continuing with Stan Hall. Stan, I'd like to get into this incredible relationship you had that spanned decades with a South American scholar named Juan Maurice, and pardon me if I'm butchering his name. Talk about this mostly unknown person, an amazing person that had some absolutely amazing theories about what was happening in Ecuador and his connection with a quest for lost treasure.
Yes, well, there are two parts to this story. One is treasure, and the other is history. Juan was of Hungarian background, of good family. They scurried out of Hungary, I think, to France when the Russians moved in, and ultimately Argentina became his second home. He took on what job he could and became a kind of continental salesman for agricultural products and so on. But of course, with a mind like his, he became very close with some of the high-level leading people in South America. We're talking about, for example, he advised Pérez Jiménez, the then president of Venezuela, during the Russian invasion of Hungary in 1958. Was it 56? That he should immediately fly a plane into Budapest and bring out as many Hungarian professionals and take them to Venezuela as possible. And that actually happened, which is probably why there's a high incidence of people of Hungarian stock in Venezuela. And Pérez Jiménez, his whole family apparently were quite close with Juan Maurice. I remember Juan telling me a story that at the residence of Pérez Jiménez, there arrived a little cart all done up with bells and flowers, and two little carts pulled by little Welsh ponies, a bit like Shetland ponies, and themselves all done up with bells and jingles and so on. And this was an amazing thing to suddenly arrive at the president's doorstep, and this was a gift from Juan Maurice.
Wow.
For the president's two young children. So that's how close he was there. I know in Argentina he was always being invited to top tables all around the country. It didn't matter whether they were of a right-wing or left-wing tables. But Juan was always someone they liked to be seen with. And meantime, at the back of his mind, he was looking at I now believe he had been studying a lot what a number of Hungarian historians have been looking at for quite some time, and that is the origin of the Hungarian peoples. You know, the Hungarian language is very difficult to connect with any other language in Europe. It's tied to Finnish, it's tied to Estonian, a bit Turkish, and so on. Apparently, it was much more widespread, especially during the time of the Roman Empire. And these Hungarians, I also believe, played a big part in ancient British history. Up in Scotland, because the Scots didn't write their early history, they were classified, of course, as savages, Picts and Scots. But on analysis, the 7 major clans or tribes of the so-called Lost Pictish tribes all have Hungarian names if they're analyzed. The tribe that threw Julius Caesar out of the country, and bear in mind he had taken over invade Britain, the most experienced veteran army in the world, and they were sent packing in 3 weeks by a superior British force, and using chariots which were, strangely enough, of Hittite style, and the main tribe in Britain, the noble tribe, one might say, at that time was called the Kasi, or Kazi. Now, it's not long ago that I came across the fact that the Kazi were an old Hungarian tribe. And I immediately thought to myself, now I wonder if that Hungarian tribe anciently built Stonehenge. Because I think the secret of Stonehenge lies in that name, as long as you read it as Hungarian, Istenhenger, Isten meaning God, and Henger meaning circle or cylinder. In other words, the cylinder of God is circle of God. And I'm trying to look a little bit further into that, but my intuition is telling me that these same Kasi that chased Julius Caesar out some centuries later from Britain were the same Kasi that built Istenhenger or Stonehenge, and they were of Magyar background. Now, when I say Magyar, one's beliefs also were that they had the Phoenicians, for example, and when you look at that word Phoenician, Phoenicians, it looks rather strange when you write it down. And of course, you could interpret it as has been done, as a Venetian. And of course, Venetia was a kind of purple dye that was used by the priestly sects in these days. But it also Phoenician can also be read as Phoenician and Hunoshan, or Hunos or Huns. And this is a tack that one, of course, has taken. And although it is generally accepted the Hungarian language came from the north of Europe, from tribes, invading tribes of the north, like the Ostiaks and Keremists and so on, one holds the view, as more and more ancient historians or historians studying ancient history are doing, believe that Hungarian is of Sumerian origin. Mm-hmm. Or vice versa. Do you understand?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting lines of speculation that he opened up, was that the similarity between the old Magyar and Sumerian tongues cannot be attributed to coincidence. And in fact, didn't he go on to say that he thinks that actually this is all going to be traced back to Ecuador, and that in fact Ecuador would have been the origin place of the Sumerian tongue, and not only the Sumerian, but also the Egyptian as well.
Yes. Well, it wasn't one that said what I'm going to now say. It was my little voice inside me that when I was over in Ecuador, and I was there for quite some time, it dawned on me one day that the name Atlantis, and I was never a person to believe in Atlantis, but The name Atlantis, see, if it's broken down into two elements, we'll read Atl and Antis. Mm-hmm. And Atl over there in the Amerindian language means either it means old or it means of the time of the mother waters, that is the time of the deluge. And the Antis is simply the Amerindian word for the Andes themselves. And amongst the four parts of the ancient kingdom of Tawantinsuyu, or P-Inca Tawantinsuyu, you have like Kuntisuyu, Chinchasuyu, and then to the east in the Andean area, it's called Antisuyu, which means land of the Antis.
Land of the Antis. You know, that's very interesting because the Hopi, in their creation mythology, tell that they were rescued from a deluge by the ant people. Would you surmise there's a connection?
Strange enough, I read that the other day. That's very, very coincidental, but then we shouldn't be believing in coincidences when we're talking about the same things that we're both interested in.
Right.
Because if you're like me, you don't believe in coincidences.
No, it's like a UFO. I've never seen one. And so Juan Moritz makes these incredible connections, in building a bridge in his mind between the old and new worlds. But he goes out one step further and says that there was a library of metal books containing the history and scientific knowledge of an unknown advanced civilization which spoke this language you're referring to, Magyar, which is the mother tongue, he believed, of Quechua, Sumerian, Sanskrit, and others, and that this library of metal books is hidden in a subterranean world of the Andes. And what I want to talk about when as we continue here more and more is your incredible journey throughout the 1970s to actually follow the trail of these clues to bring forward the lost secrets of this ancient archive. But before we do that, we've just got a couple of minutes here before we go to the break, Stan. One of the things that just struck me so profound about his research too, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this, is Juan Moritz's alleged discovery of irrefutable proof within this metal library of the extraterrestrial origins of the Atlantis Magyar language, and he traced this to the constellation Ursa Major. Can you talk about that just for a moment here?
Yes, okay. First of all, you'll understand I was coming from a very Scottish Presbyterian skeptical background into this story. And I knew that once I started, I'd have to I'd finish up walking, let's say, a mystical path with very practical Scottish feet. And I saw that as a very good tool to take along, and it served me extremely well. And Juan was very pleased about that because he saw very little difference between Scots and Hungarians. If you look at them, they all have traditional types of similar dances and colourful national dress and bagpipes and so on and so on. So we used to pull the Basques into that little conversation as well, of course. And there's a lot of similarities between them. But I have to make this very clear. The first time I ever heard about the Caves of the and Juan Moritz was in Eric von Daniken's book, Gold of the God. If I had not read that, I don't know when I would have heard of the Caves of the Taos. It just so happened that when I was reading that book, I was very much investigating my own line of ancient history. And,
Stan, can I ask you to if we can take a quick break here? We're up on the break, and I want to continue this because this takes us right into the heart of this mystery. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about it. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Stan Hall. Stan, just before the break, we had broached the subject of the illustrious Eric von Daniken's involvement in this mystery, and you were noting that you read his blockbuster book, Gold of the Gods, the book that came right after Chariots of the Gods, didn't it?
Yes, it did. But it was a more sensational story in many ways. Mm-hmm. And because, he was following an interesting line in his book, and I have to say that Eric did come to visit me in Quito. I haven't mentioned that in his book, in my book, but he did. And the upshot of that was he got up, we shook hands, and he said, you know, Mr. Hall, you're not at all the person I was expecting to meet. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. But his secretary, of course, had said, well, we set up the meeting, Eric would like to see you. I said, well, I should warn you that Eric has always looked on you as almost his worst enemy since 1976. Because the sales of his books went down dramatically after our expedition. Well, I have to make it very clear that that 76 expedition, the major one, specifically excluded any search for treasure and was very much controlled by the Ecuadorian government and so on. They didn't want controversy, et cetera, et cetera. But I have talked about it with Eric, and I think when I said to him, you know, Eric, I think if we all look back 20 years, there are many things we've said we wish we hadn't said. And he sort of gave me a knowing smile, and I think we understood what I was really saying to him, because he was greatly criticized for the way he wrote the book. And I think in my book I say, yes, I think he was probably right to publish, but not the way he did. And I think now he would be the first to acknowledge that. Now, to move more to the core of your question, I'm sorry I diverged a lot there. Juan almost had done so much investigation of history, certainly to my satisfaction, almost to justify what he was ultimately aiming at, and that was to get the connection between basically the origin of civilization in the Americas. And that after the deluge, there had been a mass exodus from the Atlantis into various parts of the world, including Mesopotamia, of course. And they were able to do this because they used these balsa wood to build the rafts. It's light and it's the perfect material to build rafts across the Pacific, as others have since shown. And they took with them their collective wisdom and, according to Juan, established the major civilized centers of the world.
Can I mention something here, Stan? You note that the word Magyar, M-A-G-Y-A-R, may in fact be Magi, A-R, which can be interpreted, you say, as serpent priest or serpent king. So are you saying here that what we're seeing in this time, then, is the reemergence of these serpent kings, the Magi, in effect, that turn up in virtually every tradition emerging from the Middle East at that time?
Yes, yes. The word Magi, Magyar, as you know, gives rise to words like majestic and so on. And Juan was quite clear that the Maya and the Magyars were one and the same, for example. And he talked long about the different civilizations that spoke and still speak languages very close to the ancient Magyar language. Now, he himself is sorry?
You may have mentioned this is so important to us right now, too, Stan, because Maya 2012 prophecy talks about the return of an enlightened being riding upon something they describe as a serpent rope. And so if we just can conjecture here for a moment, if indeed an enlightened being, a serpent king, a Maya serpent king, is preparing to return around 2012, we need to get a hold of the kind of knowledge that Juan Moritz possessed, because we're going to have to understand the knowledge and the potential revelations that this being or this consciousness, if in fact it's not a being but rather a consciousness, will ultimately represent. So I just wanted to put that on the table, that now seems to be a very important time for this kind of research in the archives of Atlantis, as you're describing, to come forward.
Yes, absolutely. I have to perhaps take another tack with the 2012. I'm into catastrophism, mainly Velikovsky catastrophism, which I find has served me extremely well. And I rather think that because the Mayas have the Quetzalcoatl and the Huitzilopochtli and so on, and the Incas, the Viracocha and the Pachacutec, etc., that these were actually planets, the same sort of planets that were seen by, let's say, the Trojans during the Trojan Wars and by most of the ancient civilizations. They tell the same story using different names for different gods. Mm-hmm. And out of that, I see that what has gone wrong with our religions is that there's been an exchange of power and divinity between priests and planets, and somehow we've all got screwed up with the results that we're facing today. Now, having said that, I'm not one of those that believes there's going to be a major world catastrophe in 2012. I think what the Mayas were talking about was what they actually saw at that time would be a comet. And if you follow the Velikovskian philosophy, then it would be the planet Venus. And, of course, we know the planet Venus now is fairly stable in relation to the Earth, although it's, of course, proved to be much younger than anyone thought it was in recent times. And I think that shows that Velikovsky may be in the right track there. That Venus may well have blasted out of Jupiter, as the mythologists say. And this whole question of reading mythology more as history, I think, is one of the most important things we have to do if we want to understand what's happening to us or what has happened to us and the causes of it, as being a kind of suppressed amnesia of what actually went on. When a terrible disaster happens, you tend to want to bury your head and forget it. And I think the whole of civilization has probably got to face that trauma yet, and before it can begin to feel whole again. And not just with the Maya prediction, but the same events took place all over the world, and most of the civilizations kept records. You find them in the Mahabharata or in the Egyptian records or the Hebrew records. It doesn't matter where you look. Genesis basically tells the story. And we have stones in Scotland standing out in the cold, showing the famous spectacle and Z-rod marking. And I've interpreted that as one of the times of the, or a pictograph, if you like, of a major catastrophe that did take place. And the people of that time wanted to leave some kind of record, perhaps a warning that it could happen again. And the Z, which I thought was going to turn out to be, let's say, an arrow, could well be a massive electrical discharge between two planets, and the ends are shaped as the same sort of shapes that you will get when you do the laboratory tests that people like Andre Perot and some of the Thunderbolt group catastrophists are presently investigating at this moment in time. So catastrophism, I'm saying, has a major, major role to play in our understanding, and I do think that it's the bridge between evolutionism and creationism, because creationism has a lot to do with catastrophism in a way. And I'm hoping this battle between intelligent designers and evolutionists will find the courage to face up to the fact that we are missing a massive piece of history because we're not accepting that these major catastrophes took place at fairly identifiable times.
And more recent than we might have previously thought, right?
Exactly.
And so do you see that the suppression of this evidence, is there a conspiracy to withhold this knowledge of these cataclysms from us, or is it simply that we, until this time, have not really recognized the truth of those cataclysms?
Well, I think it's because the way that someone like Velikovsky puts it, it's put in, and has to be put in an interdisciplinary way. And probably, let's say, a comparatively small mind like mine, nevertheless, has come from an interdisciplinary background. I was into architecture and building, and you have to deal with every type of art and scientific discipline in these fields. And putting together even the Ecuador expedition, I mean, that was done within 18 months when it should have taken 4 years by, let's say, someone who'd never organized an expedition before and had never been in a jungle. But it was a background of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge that enabled me to do that. Now, it's very, very difficult to understand what some of the catastrophists are saying because they're coming from a multidisciplinary background. And therefore, the key specialists, key scientists, who are very much occupied doing their main line of work, don't always have the time. In fact, choose not to get into a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary world. And until that happens, it's going to be very difficult to take the cover off the missing history.
I agree.
But geology,
we're up on a break again, so I'm going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk more about the expedition and Neill Armstrong's involvement in it. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Stan Hall. Stan, I wanted to get back into the expedition that you launched in search of this, not just the cave, but also how it led you into more deeply into an understanding or a possible understanding of what this metal library and also the crystal library might contain itself. Let's get into that now, and let's talk first about the involvement of the first man on the moon, Neill Armstrong. Tell us about his involvement and how that came to be. Yes.
Okay. Strange enough, there was nothing dramatic about this. Our expedition began to grow in size. It started off as the target was to have a small, compact, highly efficient expedition. Then, when the Ecuadorian government got involved, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. Anyway, we got to the stage where we thought, well, we're going to need some kind of titular head for our expedition. And various names were brought up, including Prince Charles, because I happen to know that he studied archaeology, he's very interested in archaeology, and he might just come along. And then, but my main proposal was Neill Armstrong, and for this reason. Number one, when I'd been out to Ecuador on reconnaissance visits the previous 9 months or so, the American embassy and particular individuals and their families of the American embassy warmly welcomed us. I can remember Colonel Doherty, who was doing the Landsat photography of Ecuador at the time, saying, "God damn," he says, "you guys sitting on that aircraft carrier out there in the Atlantic Ocean, we thought you were sinking below the waves, and now here you all are here with all your old British pioneering spirit again. Goddamn." So he was really something. And they threw barbecues for us and this and that. And in fact, they stepped in and helped us take aerial surveys for the area we wanted to go in. Well, I said, okay, we happen to be going in July 1976. Mm-hmm. That happens to be right on the nub of the American bicentennial.
Right.
And Independence Day is even on the 4th of July. Even though we Brits sometimes joke that we celebrate independence from America rather than America from Britain. But anyway, there it was right there. And I said, well, I think as a token of the help that we've been given by the Americans in Ecuador particularly, and because it's a bicentennial, why don't we try and ask Neill Armstrong? And of course everybody jumped in and said, well, that's ridiculous because you just said it's the bicentennial and the 4th of July, we're going in July, and he'll be in a tremendous demand. And I said, well, okay, but nevertheless, I happen to know that Neill Armstrong his forefathers had come from a Scottish town by the name of Langham, which means long home, to the south of Scotland, and that he was already a free man, had been made a free man of that town. And that is the spiritual home of the Armstrongs. And I know that because my mother was also an Armstrong from Langham. So, in fact, there's some kind of connection we understand. Neill and I have still got a little bit of contact at various anniversary times. Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad to hear that he was telling me that his family, looking into his background, are tending to believe that they didn't come from Armstrongs that went to Fermanagh in Ireland, but they came straight from Scotland. So we're very pleased to hear about that. But the point is that I wrote this letter to the town clerk of Langham explaining what we'd like to do. And so he wrote a letter to Neill. And if ever I want to see how to write a letter to persuade anybody to do anything, I will bring out this letter from Eddie Armstrong, was his name, because it was a most persuasive and polite letter. So I can remember sitting around the conference table in Edinburgh on last night with all the parties represented that were involved in the expedition. Everything had gone so beautifully after all the problems. And I said, okay, there's something I'd like to read out. And I read out a letter from Neill Armstrong saying that he would be honored to take the part of honorary president of the expedition, and that, God willing, he might be able to participate. And that was it. There were no sort of thoughts of the fact that he happened to be, let's say, an extraterrestrial in the sense that he had been to the moon and come back again. These were not thoughts in, although the danger was quite clear because of the Eric von Daniken involvement. But I sat with him in the hotel room in Quito the day he arrived and brought him quickly up to date with what was happening on the expedition. And I brought up this question of the controversy that was running around it. The newspapers were talking about von Daniken and flying saucers and Neill Armstrong and so on. Mm-hmm. And I always remember what he said, look, Stan, I'm not afraid of controversy. As long as the facts are clear. And I thought that was a magnificent and simple thing for him to say. So I was immediately relaxed. And I never really expected to see him in Quito. It was a surprise to get the telex to say, I hope the expedition is doing well, and I hope to be in Quito on August 1st, I think it was, 1976. And how do I get down to the caves? So immediately you could imagine there was a tremendous upheaval to reorganize all kinds of things. Right. And of course I wanted him. I said, well, look, he's coming with his backpack and his plimsolls, and we'll get him in with one or two of the scientists because we had some top scientists there, including thermoluminescent dating people and so on. And I got him into a small hotel because it was the conference season and all the hotels were full. Well, of course, as soon as the embassies found out about this, they somehow removed someone from the best suite in the best hotel in Quito, and he got that place. And he entered into the spirit of the whole thing, and I understand that he thinks fondly of that expedition because, of course, he was going, let's say, the opposite way. He was going back into, let's say, ancient history, down into the bowels of the earth at the center of the world, if you like. Mm-hmm. And it was a nice counterpoint, I thought, to his work in space, and especially his landing on the moon.
Certainly highly symbolic. Stan, your website is goldlibrary.com. Goldlibrary.com. And on your website, you talk about Armstrong's involvement, and then you pose a question. Let the webmaster know your answer to the following question. in July 1969, the crew of Apollo 2 left an instrument on the moon called a Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector Array, basically a 2-foot diameter mirror. What was or is its purpose? Tell us about that question in the few moments we have left.
Okay. Well, I put that in because locally, I live in Dunbar, as you know there now, but also you don't know that I live in the actual house where the famous environmentalist John Muir was raised. And I always have kept John Muir's philosophy at the back of me when I've been in the jungle and dealing with other people there. Now, I'm sorry, I missed your point there.
I'm wondering why you're so interested in that question about the mirror that was left on the moon. Right.
Now, the reason I put that in was I had just read that something like 20 million Americans don't believe that Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Mm-hmm. And that rather impacted me, and I thought, well, that's very sad, because there's no way that reflecting mirror, whose purpose was to measure the distance at various times between the Earth and the moon, that was the answer, could get there on its own. It has to be positioned properly, and that's exactly what's been done. And it was the astronomical center in London that confirmed that to me, and they've been measuring the distance ever since then. And it seems rather sad that there are so many Americans who still think that Apollo 11 didn't land on the moon. That was one of the reasons. I made that a question because I set up locally here on a local website 2 of my books as prizes for the first 2 people that answered that correctly.
Great. So one final question, Stan. Is there a treasure, a metal library, perhaps of thousands of volumes, and a second library of polished, transparent tablets awaiting discovery in South America?
Yes, I believe yes. Now, I'm saying that as someone who never believes anything until he actually touches or sees it. That is the only time in my life I have ever come to a conclusion that the story had to be true, because I had spent so long listening to Moritz, and then after Moritz died, I spent 6 years on a daily, weekly basis with the man I ultimately came to believe had found the treasure. So he was happy to describe every little detail of it, and we agreed, for the safety of both our families, that he would not tell me the actual location. In fact, it was me that said that to him. You tell me everything, but don't tell me the actual location. So that's how we carried on, and we were busy putting together the plan for what he called the expedition of occupation. I had already talked with most of the ambassadors of major countries with embassies in Quito. We decided to treat Quito as an international office, set up an ambassador committee who would oversee a scientific group who would then go in for 3 or 4 months, do the initial studies, come out with proposals on what should now be done, and so on. And we were in that when, unfortunately, he was killed. Now, I personally don't believe he was killed for any sinister reason. I think it was just that particular evening he happened to be carrying with him quite a bit of money. And in Ecuador, there's quite a number of gangs that are willing to mug people, and he was the sort of man that fought back, unfortunately, in this case, and he was killed. So that sort of put the dampers on that, and that's when I began to reanalyze everything that happened over the previous 20-odd years, and came to the conclusion that definitely it must exist. There is no other. There's no other explanation to me personally. And having said that, I have to add, of course, I could be wrong because I don't have it in my hand. and I have no actual proof. But I'm hoping when people read my book, Taos Gold, that they will say, oh, well, at least Stan Hall was in the best position of anyone else to gather information, bring all the facts together, and try to make it happen. And I have to say, it was never my friend. His name was Petronio Jaramillo. It was never Petronio that let me down. It was me that let him down, because it was so difficult trying to get the resources to make the expedition of occupation happen without being too overt, without being too public. Because if you have any experience of Ecuador, I mean, it's my second country and I love them, but trying to make things happen and get things done in an organized way is not their best talent. And
right.
It would have been impossible to make it happen that way.
Well, Stan,
we've
come to the end of our time together, Stan, but I want to thank you very much for sharing this incredible story with us, and I hope everyone will follow up by visiting your website, goldlibrary.com, and pick up a copy of Taos Gold, The Archives of Atlantis. So once again, Stan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
Crop circle season is coming back, and it's coming back to the United States in a big way. Linda has the first report of a crop laid down in the continental United States in this spring, and very early in the spring indeed. You're about to experience something, in fact, that you just can't get elsewhere. Linda is an Emmy award-winning science reporter, and deservedly so. She reports on the leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. You must go to her website, earthfiles.com, because it's the one science website that really gives you the facts and tells you the secrets that the others are ignoring. earthfiles.com. You're about to hear one of the more fascinating reports about crop circles that you've heard in a long time. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, Whitley. Two of the first American cases of strangely down crop in the genre of crop formations that I personally investigated were discovered on May 24th, 1992. Yeah, that's 15 years ago, in the neighboring communities of Linfield and Limerick, Pennsylvania. That young wheat had long, straight sections that were scalloped along the edges as if a pulsing energy had laid those plants down with methodical precision. Some sections of the flattened crop were neatly parted like hair, with each side going in opposite directions. There were woven layers overlapping in 90-degree angles. As strange as it all was, pilots flying over said to local residents, well, it must be wind damage. But according to a Ursinus College scientist back in 1992 who collected plants for study, he found stems bending at angles from growth nodes, as biophysicist Levengood would also report over the following years from crop formations all over the world. Not wind damage, the scientists concluded. 15 years later, in May 2005, another wheat farmer, this time in the Phoenix, Arizona suburb of Tolleson, found flattened pathways about 600 feet long and paralleling two power lines and a road that went along the edge of his huge wheat field. Biophysicist W.C. Levengood's analysis of the Tolleson randomly down wheat found the same biochemical and biophysical changes that he has confirmed in the more dramatic geometric crop formations from many countries. Tolleson is west of Phoenix. Now, more unusual down plants have been discovered on the east side of Phoenix in the suburb of Chandler. That was on March 25th, 2007, when resident Michael A. Polani took good photographs, and then he forwarded them to Jeffrey Wilson, director of the Independent Crop Circle Research Association in Ohio. When Jeff sent me an email with the photographs, I immediately thought of the unusual Limerick, Pennsylvania, and Tolleson, Arizona fields. All three have pulsing, wavy edges in the standing crop along big, long stretches of down plants. And in this new Chandler case, the farmer has still not been located, and the exact identity of the crop is unknown. But it might be a sorghum or Sudan grass grown as ground cover or low-grade animal feed. Whatever the crop is, the wavy, pulsing edges signify that something extraordinary happened that is not characteristic of normal wind damage. I talked with Jeff Wilson about the anomalous features in this first American, what is called randomly downed, but unusual crop formation in this beginning of the 2007 season.
The effect that's left behind from whatever is making the plants go down is that it leaves signs of a wave-like effect. You're looking down a very long, extended, straight, flattened pathway. And on either side of the flattened crop, where the standing crop is, you essentially have a regular indentation every 2-3 feet going into the standing stuff, which seems to be perpendicular to the general flow of the plants that are flattened in a straight line. We've seen this type of wave-like flattening in the standing edge of the crop right adjacent to the flattened stuff in several randomly down type formations. In the past, you mentioned the Limerick case that goes all the way back to May of 1992.
Right.
A couple more recent ones. There was the Tolleson, Arizona one that was in barley from May of 2005. And also Carmichael, Pennsylvania, Greene County, Pennsylvania, that was late June of 2005, where we had these straight lines in the crop, but also exhibiting this wave-like effect. The most recent one was, we saw one last year on April the 22nd in Fairfax, Ohio, where we saw this example of this wave-like pattern in the standing edge.
Which I've always referred to as the pulsing, because it is so regular. I associate this pulsing or wave edge with 90-degree angled woven sections also in the so-called randomly downed. There is also this cross weave 90-degree angle of these plants in the part that's flattened.
Yes, Michael Polanyi, one of the photographs that he took, shows very clearly this flattening at 90-degree angles to each other and creating a three-layer weave, at least in one section. This 90-degree effect we've now seen in several cases, including the Fairfax, Ohio from last year and the Carmichael, Pennsylvania one from 2005, in which there are small rectangular or square sections flattened first in one direction and then perpendicular to it there's another small square section, then another one, to create what we would call a checkerboard effect, being flattened in these long linear pathways.
Is there anything about any of this that you think could fall into a meteorological phenomenon category?
That's a good question. We don't have any information about when this formation in Chandler took place. We don't know if there was any weather involved or wind involved, but certainly the effects left behind match up very well with other randomly downed formations that we've looked at in years past.
And if it's not meteorological, what could do these patterns with that pulsing wave edge with the 90-degree woven flat areas?
Yes, that's still the big question. That's why we're still looking at crop circles. I will say that this particular location has many of the same contextual features surrounding it that we find in a lot of other crop circle formation cases, both geometric and non-geometric, in the sense that it was right adjacent to power lines. The closest power line pole had a transformer box on it. It was the lowest section of the area. This area is very flat. Michael Polanyi told me that this field in particular is about 4 feet lower than all the adjacent properties. Now, this is in Arizona, and so you think it's very dry there, and it is. One of the things we find is that crop circle formations are coming down very close to water. In this case, it turns out that the whole length of the field is bordered on two sides by one of the canals that's filled with water right now. That canal actually dates back to prehistoric times. That was one of the old Hohokam canals that was built maybe 2,000 years ago. That kind of feature seems to be one of the things that we find is that these crop circle formations are coming down near old ancient archaeological sites, and this seems to have all of the same contextual features surrounding it that all these other crop circles seem to have.
So in this modern day of 2007, when we don't think of Phoenix as being a place of ancient sites, it really is. And I was going to ask you if you had any speculation about why this phenomenon, in all of its mystery, might choose the Phoenix, Arizona region to put down early patterns in the United States.
We have a very long extended growing season. If crop circles need to have crops to come down in, and so this is where there are crops right now in the United States. So early on we see things in Arizona, and the most recent geometric pattern that's happened in North America happened in December in Mexico, 200 miles or 300 miles to the south. So we see crop circles throughout the entire year across the North American continent. Why pick Phoenix? Well, you mentioned that Phoenix isn't necessarily known for its ancient sites, but it actually does have quite a few ancient sites. Not only did the Hohokam peoples build these enormous canal structures, which allowed them to become some of the first farmers in North America, but they also built very large pyramids, what they call platform mounds, flat-top pyramids in large Pueblo villages, many of which are found throughout the Phoenix area and an enormous concentration to the northeast of Phoenix.
Do you have any intuitive sense in your exposure to so many patterns over the years about what the link might be between a very ancient intelligence that knows a great deal about the Earth and what we're calling the modern era of crop formations globally?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think that we really know the full extent of any connection to that right now. However, there does appear to be this correlation very strongly between where crop circles are being reported and finding these ancient sites across North America. The number that we have in our databases, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the crop circles being reported are coming down in very close proximity to these ancient archaeological sites.
Biophysicist W.C. Levengood, who has studied so many crop formation plants and soils, hypothesizes that spinning plasma vortices are involved with crop circle creations. But what unidentified trigger provokes the spinning plasmas? Are the mysterious lights so often associated with crop formations an unidentified natural phenomenon? Or could they be plasmas supervised by an advanced intelligence which humans have yet to encounter? Could the mysterious lights in crop circles be connected to the same ancient intelligence which inspired other marks around the world in ziggurats, pyramids, mounds, and stone circles? In addition to the mysteries about how the complex crop formations are created, there is always the question, why? Do the often geometric patterns contain a mathematical language? If so, has something over the past decades been trying to warn us that life on Earth is not guaranteed and that great changes are upon us in global warming, rising sea levels, expanding droughts, intensifying storms and hurricanes, threats to food production, and increasing extinctions in Earth's life, which cannot adapt to the speed in which ecosystems are changing? Drowning polar bears are an example. Even the U.S. Supreme Court decided in the first week of April 2007 in a 5-4 vote that the Environmental Protection Agency has an obligation to regulate greenhouse gases from automobiles and industries as global warming threatens the security of Earth life in the decades to come. A few days later, on April 6, 2007, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued another report about the consequences of global warming in the Earth's future. Here is a short and sobering list of some expected outcomes. 1/4 of Africa's billion people will lose most of their water supply. Food production will fall by half in many countries. Sea level rise by a meter or more will force millions of coastal residents to move inland, provoking unimaginable refugee and political crises. North America will suffer more intense hurricanes, floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. Before the IPCC report was released April 6th, scientists were complaining that the facts would be watered down. One of the scientists who contributed to the report is Stephen Schneider, professor of biological sciences and interdisciplinary environmental studies at Stanford University. Professor Schneider has been studying the Earth's climate since 1971. I asked him if he thought the ICC report was watered down.
There's always a typical propensity to find the components of an event that are lurid. And at the event I was at last week, there were components of the event that were lurid. You can find them. But the truth is about 85% of the document really was at least as good or in some cases improved by the interventions of the government. We ran into trouble on 2 or 3, and I won't deny them, I think fairly significant components of the report that a few nations chose to refuse to cooperate on. I guess they thought it was an iconic threat against their own interests, and when you're in the UN system, it's by consensus. Consensus means everybody. If 2 countries say no, the system is blocked. If the scientists say what they want to do is scientifically inaccurate, the system is blocked. And then you go into what we call contact groups, face-to-face, you resolve the language. Even the contact groups could not resolve the language. That's very unusual. And there were a couple of issues that got watered down.
Well, which countries gave the biggest resistance?
One has done it every single time since the IPCC began, and that's Saudi Arabia. Anybody surprised? Why would they want to have a report which discusses the seriousness of a problem created by the burning of their primary export product, oil? So it's not a surprise. And they play the game very honestly. They say, this language is not acceptable to our delegation. They don't even pretend to use scientific arguments. They just refuse. China, on the other hand, which up till now has generally been occasionally suspicious, but by and large a pretty good player, just over and over and over blocked. But they used a different tack, and that's what got many of the lead authors angry, is they started saying that their own experts said that what the lead author said was not scientifically accurate. They produced no such experts. They did not give the nature of the details. They just asserted it. When challenged, they stiffened their back and said, we're not going to vote for it. That led to a pretty angry outburst because scientists are not the type to be told by somebody whose power comes from being a government person that you're wrong, and you're wrong scientifically, but I won't tell you how, and I have the power to block you. So a lot of people were pretty angry about that. Now, they didn't do this in every paragraph. We wouldn't have had a report. They only did it 4 or 5 times. But they certainly picked important items, and it was very difficult to get a compromise from either the Chinese or the Saudis. Once or twice, the U.S. did it. I was not very happy about that, but 80 times the U.S. was cooperative. 3 or 4 times I thought they were really making kind of ridiculous, in one case legalistic, and another inappropriate ways to slightly weaken the report. But the U.S. was a very minor offender, and as I said, on balance, they were much more positive than negative, which surprised me, considering the history of the Bush administration in dealing with the blockade of their own government scientists from talking to the media. You know, government scientists in climate change have been forced to have all the media questions bounced over to the PR agency. It's been going on for years. And finally, this Congress, being of the other party, is having hearing after hearing on it and smashing them after smashing them on this behavior. So we had kind of expected that, but I was very pleasantly surprised that the U.S. is a overall positive force at the meetings. go once or twice, no.
What were the sticking points specifically for the Chinese and specifically for the U.S.?
The U.S. removed some language in the table about the long-term commitment to sea level rise if we start melting the Greenland ice sheet on the grounds it was too speculative. Now, it is speculative, but it was labeled as speculative. And the probability that your house or mine will burn down is about 1%, yet every one of us has fire insurance. We're talking about the planetary life support system with a probability well higher than 1% of potential deglaciation of major ice sheets and a 1,000-year commitment to 10 or more feet of sea level rise. That's not a trivial issue. Just because it's speculative does not mean it should be removed. It was removed because it was dramatic and they didn't want a dramatic statement in there. We disagreed with the U.S. on that, but of course had the U.S. supported it, it would have been blocked by the Chinese and the Saudis anyway.
Mm-hmm.
There was another even more important item where in this very table I'm talking about the one which had listed as a function of how warm it is. So we had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 degrees warming, and of course nobody knows how much it'll be warming because we'd have to know how many people in the world, what standards of living they demand, and what technologies we use. And those are, of course, social assumptions about how the world would be organized. Plus there are other uncertainties having to do with the climate itself. So what we wanted to do to try to give people a guide is underneath each of these headings for how much warming there would be was a block of text, words like up to 10% of species threatened, 10 to 40% of species threatened with extinction. And as you get warmer, of course, it gets more intense. Greater than 40% of species at extreme risk of extinction if you go above 4 degrees. These are all Celsius. Those are big numbers. So that's how the table is constructed. Up to 1 to 2 degrees, crop yields improving in high latitudes because of longer growing seasons. After 3 degrees, crop yields decreasing everywhere, and even at 1 or 2, decreasing in the already hot and poor countries. So all of those factors were there, and what we wanted to do was to show the world how much does it take to warm up 1 to 3 degrees. So we put above the table a timeline for 2020, 2050, and 2080 with a wide range of warming associated with very high emission scenarios and very low. So people would see that if we had policy to eliminate some of the emissions, it would make a difference in lowering risks. And the U.S. was very supportive of leaving that in, and we were very proud of them for that. So on the really big one, they were on the right side of it. But the Chinese and the Saudis were their usual blocking selves on that one, and we could not get it in.
I cannot help but thinking that Mount Kilimanjaro will probably not have any snow on the top by 2009 or 10, and we're at 2007. And that means that a mountain in which the glacier has helped feed the water for the 35 million people who live there, that just in the next 5 years, we're going in one part of Africa, we're going to be facing water shortages already because of global warming.
One metaphor is the supertanker headed for the rocks. Just remember the one thing about supertankers, they turn very slowly and they have very bad brakes. That's why I said we should have started 25 years ago. Another favorite metaphor is that you're in a school bus because it's the future that's really going to get the worst of this. And it's going down a steep hill with pretty iffy brakes. And then when they start getting hot, they stop working. And what do they say? Oh, so far, so good.
Is it possible that we already have passed the point of no return in terms of the Earth continuing now to get warmer and warmer and that there's nothing humans can do?
No, I don't think that that's the case. I've never been the catastrophist in that regard. We're not going to be Venus from anything that we're going to do. We're going to just make it pretty miserable for us and other species, but very, very differentially around the world. Don't be a poor person in a hot country or live in Hurricane Alley. And I didn't mention the whole world there. Some areas won't be as severely harmed for many, many, many decades. Others are being harmed already. So it's a patchwork quilt, and it's very, very uneven. As a result of that, not everybody suffers equally. then you have a hard time getting a political accommodation and the cooperation that we need, because a lot of people perceive themselves as not particularly vulnerable, and therefore why should they give up their SUV?
The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is planning a third report later in 2007 on what kind of policies can the nations of this planet bring to bear on trying to affect global warming, slow it down, and increase survival on this planet. So Whitley, from crop formations to a time where scientists are themselves saying that facts are being watered down by the political representatives because the facts are so dramatic.
Well, you know, Linda, listening to that, I was thinking about, and we've got about 5 to 7 minutes right now to go, so let's talk a little bit. I want to first just react to what he was saying, and thank goodness the United States is finally becoming a little more cooperative in these areas. Before the last election, the Bush administration would have just blindsided this whole thing, I'm sure. But now they're thinking about the next election, and they know that if they keep doing that, it's going to hurt them. So that's to the good. But the other side of the coin is, first of all, Saudi Arabia is an enemy country. It really is, frankly, an enemy state. And we can't acknowledge that because we need their oil. We really have got to get off this oil program and get up into ethanol and whatever else we can find. The French are using nuclear power very successfully. Why can't we do the same? I saw on 60 Minutes the other night a story about this. They've never had a nuclear accident there with their more modern and simpler and safer reactors. We need to get into that business. We need to get into wind power. We need to get into solar power. We need to do all of these things primarily to get out from under the heel of an enemy country. Saudis were primarily responsible for 9/11. The Saudi government supports the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. They are the reason that we can't win in Iraq, and we're not going to win, and we're going to have to go home losers, one way or another, no matter what kind of a face they put on it. Now the Saudi, and also the Saudi government recently, the Saudi king recently said that Saudi Arabia now thinks that the American occupation of Iraq is illegal, and he canceled a state visit to the United States. They're hardening against us. They are an enemy country, and we need to be in a position to be able to do something about that, because mark my words, the next step down this road is the oil step, and that's going to hurt us. We're not going to like that. Right. It's a lousy country anyway. It's a police state. They hate women. They have a ridiculous fanatical religion that's embedded into the national culture and Wahhabism. It's horrible. Horrible place.
Yeah, and Professor Schneider made a point that I thought put everything in true perspective for me in a different way. He said China and India, the two biggest population blocks, we have to help them skip the Victorian age. We have to help them go immediately to advanced renewable technologies. And when he said that, I thought that is exactly what has to happen, and that this next IPCC policy proposal, it means that the countries who have seen the Western world, the United States, England, and the rest of Brazil and other countries that have used fossil fuels at great increasing rates, that those countries are going to have to take the sobering point of view. They can't go through that. They cannot go through their own fossil age. They are going to have to jump to hydrogen, to solar, to wind, to hydrogen, whatever is renewable.
Atomic power. But, Linda, it ain't happening in China, and that's why they're also against this. China is putting online a new coal-fired power plant every 7 days. Every 7 days. You're talking an end-game situation here. This is a population that is too large and is seeking prosperity that the world cannot, the planet, I say the world, we can afford to get it. The world, the planet cannot afford. It simply can't afford. And it's unfortunate that they're coming up from behind. They want what everybody else who's in the first world has. They're building it's a magnificent achievement going on in China on one level. On another level, the environment, unfortunately, is going to derail it. Like it or not, it's going to happen to them. They will be derailed. And
yes.
that is just the fact. And now, we are running out of time. We have a couple more minutes, and I want to say I was completely fascinated by his statistic that crop circles appear most often near ancient sacred sites. And I'm going to end the show. You can make a brief comment after this, but here's where I come out with that. What in the world are we missing about who we are and what our past is? Wow, what a statistic. What do you say about it?
Yes, and that is when I wrote my book, Mysterious Lights in Crop Circles, one of the big sub-themes was there appears to be a profound intelligence that has tremendous ancient knowledge about this planet, and that the juxtaposition of crop formations in ancient sites, wherever they have occurred, whether it's the United States, England, or any of the other countries, suggests that we are something that is, I don't know what dimension, this universe, I don't know where it is, but that it may have been trying all of these decades to warn us that what was coming was going to affect our very ability to live on the planet. Many, many people who went into crop formations in the early 90s got those kinds of impressions. And now, today, the juxtaposition of crop formations that continue to occur on a planet that is quickly showing that it is speeding up in its changes and that we may be facing, I hope not catastrophe, but we are facing a planet that, as Professor Schneider said, it is not going to be like anything that we have known in the past. We're talking about moving into a planet that will be warm as maybe going back a million years or more, and that this kind of change may have been, if we had been able to translate it, may have been part of the language of crop formations going back to at least the 1970s.
Well, you know, Linda, something went wrong here. I think that the first few verses of Genesis are among the most profound records ever laid down by man, because I think they describe what did go wrong. And I add to that Christ's admonition, be as the lilies of the field, neither do they sow nor they reap. And we don't know what that means. And then there's the resurrection message. And when I was face to face with the visitors, you know what they were like? They weren't like, they didn't have there was no sense of culture. You know, I didn't have the sense I was with a society even. They were more like brilliant animals. And I think that what we lost when we gained knowledge of life and death and good and evil was a kind of exquisite instinct without which no intelligent species can ever survive, because what it is letting the will of God through into our universe, using us as the conduit. It's a completely different way of being, and I just sense that that's something like that is what the Genesis records us as having lost, and now we're coming to face the final end of it, the final consequences. We've lost it, and now we have to live fully with that loss, because we have been leaving the Garden of Eden for thousands of years. It didn't happen in a day. It's still happening. And we will have fully been locked out of the garden when we starve. And that is about to happen.
Yeah, even disappearing honeybees.
Disappearing honeybees, and now there's a new wheat blight coming out of Africa that there isn't a single stalk of wheat in the world that is resistant to. It's reached England already. I'm telling you, yes, we are going to starve it. We have no idea, this whole climate change thing, what is going on. April, the coldest month of April in 113 years. Now another scientific report proves that the sun is playing a big role in global warming. And so the result of this is the Christian right is now saying, oh, don't worry about it anymore. There's nothing we can do about it. I'm sorry. You need to worry about it, whether you can do anything about it or not, if your life depends on it. Folks, it's been a very provocative Dreamland. I loved the William Henry portion of it myself. Next week.
There are a number of other possibilities. You will know that quite a number of groups are looking into alternative history for the movement of the children of Israel across the desert out of Egypt, whether in fact there's an Essene contact between the Egyptian priesthoods, perhaps those called the Choshen, which then may well have become the Chosen under the Israeli flag. But it's quite clear in the Bible that the Israelis not only were accompanied by a group of Egyptians, but that they took the treasures of Egypt out of Egypt. Now, when I was at Sunday school, nobody told me that. I found that out a long time later. And the Church of the Latter-day Saints also have a metal library at the back of their history, and about 600 BC. And there seems to be, to me, a possible connection there around that time of Nebuchadnezzar's invasions of Palestine. Now, I know quite a bit about the Mormon history, as it's called, and I hope any Mormons listening in will forgive me for using the term Mormon, because the term Latter-day Saints is something that's very long to say when you're speaking about this subject. And they also have a connection in their history with America, and I know their historians and anthropologists investigate a great deal in Central and South America. And the treasures that one is talking about with Nebuchadnezzar are very difficult to identify. One knows that when there is an invading army, the first thing they look for are the national archives and the secret deposits of the nation they're invading in order to immediately try to humiliate them. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, did not drop from the sky. He was riding his chariot, and it would take him quite a while to get to where he was expected in Jerusalem. And I think that the priesthood at that time would probably have taken steps to hide what treasures they had. The identification of what these treasures were and where they came from, I think, is a subject of quite a lot of debate.
It's very interesting that in our modern era we saw a dramatic reenactment of this drama in the United States and coalition forces with their invasion of Iraq. It's widely known that Saddam Hussein...
At 10 a.m. Pacific.
From Nashville, filling in for Whitley Strieber, this is William Henry, and this is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Imagine hacking your way through an impenetrable rainforest in search of a secret cave loaded with records of a lost civilization. At the cave's entrance, you see mystic symbols. One of them is the open sesame, but which one? The fact is, according to our guest today, Mr. Stan Hall, a system of tunnels and caves beneath Ecuador and Peru is reputed to hold an ancient treasure house of artifacts and objects of incalculable value for humanity, including 2 libraries, one containing metal books inscribed or embossed with strange inscriptions and geometric designs, and the other storing tablets of crystal. Today we're also going to pull on the thread of a golden thread of prehistory in search of a lost key of knowledge in the archives of Atlantis. My readers may think I'm talking about the lost language of the birds, the mysterious ancient language the alchemist Fulcanelli called the language of the gods, which was believed to have been spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which some think was Atlantis, and that this language was also recovered by King Solomon. Stan Hall, however, will give us reason to think that the original Eden, or center of humankind, was in the shadows of the Andes in South America, not southern Iraq. He'll tell us about his expedition to the caves of Tayos, meaning birds, a place in Ecuador, and his quest for a library of metal plates written long ago in the language of the gods. In 1976, Stan Hall, a Scottish engineer, organized a landmark expedition to the caves of the Tayos Indians in Ecuador. This search involved a dozen institutions, Joint Special Forces, and astronaut Professor Neill Armstrong as honorary president and participant. Stan was driven by curiosity about Eric von Daniken's report of this metal library allegedly found in the caves by investigator Juan Maurice in the 1960s and published in von Daniken's 1972 blockbuster Gold of the Gods. His book, Tayos Gold, The Archives of Atlantis, tells his story and that of many other amazing explorers. He joins us today from Scotland. Stan, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you.
Our pleasure. Your story is incredible. It spans decades, and I hope that in the next hour or so we're able to flesh it out to your satisfaction. In thinking about this, Stan, I'm thinking it might be best for us to begin by talking about the subject of ancient archives, since this is the backdrop of your story. And in reading your book, I was very interested in your remarks about the archives and treasures sought by Nebuchadnezzar. How about if we start by talking about those archives?
Well, you know the story of Nebuchadnezzar, who sacked Jerusalem a couple of times around 600 BC, and supposedly took the treasures of Jerusalem away. However,
let's talk about this idea that there are forces going back into deep history, maybe even connected with the Israelite priesthood of Melchizedek, that knew about our deep ancient past and have used this knowledge to manipulate us on into present times.
Yes, I think that's very true. I think that there is a confrontation between the use of knowledge, between its use for education and its use for manipulation. And these are two global opposing forces. And unfortunately, the faster we move with technology, the more confused, let's say, the masses of people become, and the more easily they are manipulated. And unfortunately, if only because they don't have time, because they're trying to feed their family or they're trying to get things done quickly during the day. There's so many things to do that the big picture escapes them. And if they're confronted with it, they will very often say, well, I don't really have time to think about that. We'll leave that to the governments. And unfortunately, and the governments know this better than anyone else, I think, that is not really the way to do it. And there's a danger, I feel, that governments, because of the same kinds of problems they have at their levels, are moving further and further away from the ordinary man in the street. And this is why I think there's more concern and more talk of conspiracies and more talk of manipulation and so on going on at this time.
Stan, we have to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'd like to delve deeper into your book, Tayos Gold, by looking into your story, your investigation and friendship with the scholar and linguist philosopher Juan Maurice. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. We're continuing with Stan Hall. Stan, I'd like to get into this incredible relationship you had that spanned decades with a South American scholar named Juan Maurice, and pardon me if I'm butchering his name. Talk about this mostly unknown person, an amazing person that had some absolutely amazing theories about what was happening in Ecuador and his connection with a quest for lost treasure.
Yes, well, there are two parts to this story. One is treasure, and the other is history. Juan was of Hungarian background, of good family. They scurried out of Hungary, I think, to France when the Russians moved in, And ultimately, Argentina became his second home. He took on what job he could and became a kind of continental salesman for agricultural products and so on. But of course, with a mind like his, he became very close with some of the high-level leading people in South America. We're talking about, for example, he advised Pérez Jiménez, the then president of Venezuela, during the Russian invasion of Hungary in 1958. Was it 56? That he should immediately fly a plane into Budapest and bring out as many Hungarian professionals and take them to Venezuela as possible. And that actually happened, which is probably why there's a high incidence of people of Hungarian stock in Venezuela. And Pérez Jiménez, his whole family apparently were quite close with Juan Moritz. I remember Juan telling me a story that at the residence of Pérez Jiménez, that arrived a little cart all done up with bells and flowers, and two little carts pulled by little Welsh ponies, a bit like Shetland ponies, and themselves all done up with bells and jingles and so on. And this was an amazing thing to suddenly arrive at the president's doorstep, and this was a gift from Juan Moritz.
Wow.
For the president's two young children. So that's how close he was there. I know in Argentina he was always being invited to top tables all around the country. It didn't matter whether they were of a right-wing or left-wing tables. But Juan was always someone they liked to be seen with. And meantime, at the back of his mind, he was looking at, I now believe he had been studying a lot what a number of Hungarian historians have been looking at for quite some time, and that is the origin of the Hungarian peoples. You know, the Hungarian language is very difficult to connect with any other language in Europe. It's tied to Finnish, it's tied to Estonian, a bit Turkish, and so on. Apparently, it was much more widespread, especially during the time of the Roman Empire. And these Hungarians, I also believe, played a big part in ancient British history. Up in Scotland, because the Scots didn't write their early history, they were classified, of course, as savages, Picts and Scots. But on analysis, the 7 major clans or tribes of the so-called Lost Pictish tribes all have Hungarian names if they're analyzed. They tried that threw Julius Caesar out of the country, and bear in mind he had taken over invade Britain, the most
connected himself, in fact believed he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and like Nebuchadnezzar, assembled a vast library of ancient archives and documents. And what was the very first thing that occurred upon the invasion of Baghdad in 2003? We had the looting of the National Archives of Iraq. Do you find it ironic that that is happening again in our present era?
Yes, it's very, very sad to me. I can remember when I got that on the news, I sat with my jaw dropping because it's something that the whole world should be concerned about. And I think you've hit on something that is worth developing a little. As a young nation, obviously America is interested in their history, is in global history. But I sometimes wonder about something that never seems to get mentioned very much in the Middle East conflict. The Middle Eastern peoples, if we can call them that, go back a very long time. So obviously their culture and their way of looking at things is much older and longer tested than perhaps a younger nation like America. And I sometimes wonder if that's not something that should be considered by Washington and initially by Saddam Hussein and his government. The trouble is, when you get a dictator in power, there is absolutely no reasoning with them. And someone as egocentric as Hussein is very, very difficult to deal with. And if he sees himself as a mission, then it's impossible to deal with. And, of course, that's what led to the war. But underneath all of this, it is something that is very sad to see history being torn apart. I try to look at the world through a very little formula that all politics comes out of history, and all history comes out of geography. And all geography essentially comes out of geology. And most wars have always been about raw materials and minerals. And there's no escaping this. I'm not saying this is what's going on in Iraq, but it certainly is very difficult to find any war that took place in, let's say, South America that has not been over mineral resources.
Right. Stan, you write that not until the global slaughter of the 20th century did people of all religious persuasion realize the price being paid forth for the deliberate camouflage of historical truth. The bloody 20th century, more than any other, demonstrated how adept at doublespeak and the manipulation of secrecy and fears as weapons of mass control.